Hi, I am Tuthall. I'm one of the co-directors of Hyp+Access. I lead our educational initiatives, communications, and internal nonprofit administration.
Hi, my name is Audre Wirtanen. I'm one of Hyp+Access's co-directors, and I'm leading the development and launch of Hyp+Care.
Today, we're talking about how Hyp+Access's approach differentiates us and why this is essential. To donate to Hyp+Access, please visit hypaccess.org/donate.
Based on your advocacy work and research in partnership with patients in this population, can you summarize what the patient experience is like for people who are experiencing multi-system, multi-symptom issues such as these? What kind of medical misconceptions do they run into when it comes to care?
There are many medical misconceptions that people run into, and I think they continue to run into it even after they receive accurate diagnoses, unfortunately. So a lot of times what happens is somebody might get a dysautonomia diagnosis or a POTS diagnosis first, and it is assumed that that person, that's their primary diagnosis, and then they develop everything later. But to us, um, it doesn't really matter what your first diagnosis is. We're actually going to assess you for everything and decide together, what feels most relevant to you in approaching these diagnoses and addressing them.
When it comes to what the field considers connective tissue disorders, it's this interesting thing because they have this almost sole emphasis on the joints and the body and how connective tissue impacts cause symptoms in those joints. And they focus on what they can visually, aesthetically observe. So they focus on hypermobility or extensibility of those joints using the infamously terrible Baton scale to measure hypermobility. And like we were saying earlier, are not actually thinking about true connective tissue anatomy. So the joints are not the only connective tissue. And because they're focusing on the joints only and calling that a connective tissue disorder and focusing on what they can visually observe rather than listening to the patient experience, we get this situation where people are overly focusing on hypermobility and people are really using that as the only measurement tool to get people care. And they're putting that in a bucket of connective tissue disorders and all these other things that people experience in a bucket outside that, even though mast cells are connective tissue cells. So they're not actually thinking about connective tissue disorders as full body. Sometimes they're thinking about it a little bit, but not in this truly systemic way that aligns with what anatomy is really made up of. So we have all these different misconceptions within those communities that hypermobility is the predisposing factor to getting sick. It's maybe the cause of connective tissue variants, but maybe sometimes they think it's a benign thing or something that doesn't cause problems until you have some other compounding factor occur. But they end up siloing people and their experiences into that hypermobility focused misunderstanding of connective tissue and not looking at things systemically or forcing people to get those other conditions diagnosed separately and then the care not being integrated.
There's a big problem in this field of language and what language is being used and what definitions mean at different points in time. The language of diagnostics is always changing. And so we get these periods of time when someone is diagnosed with this one medical code, and then it's a different medical code 5 years later, and then it's a different medical code. And so we have this very, for lack of a better word, disjointed data set of diagnostics that are always changing. And what that ends up doing is it pushes people out of diagnostics at different time points. And we see this happen over and over and over again. Instead of broadening diagnostics, instead of saying, okay, if experiences are all pretty similar, then we should group these people together. But they're trying to find ways of further dividing them. And one of the main ways they further divide is through observable hypermobility of joints. If we were to talk about hypermobility of connective tissues as a whole, that's a different conversation. But oftentimes what people are talking about is hypermobility of joints only. And that's going to look different in every single person because muscles get tight when things are too loose. There can be connective tissue adhesions or adherence of tissues together, which limit mobility. And then we're also not thinking about how all of the joints work together and how everything is actually interconnected. It's really an attempt to isolate. What that does is it takes away so much nuance in understanding not only somebody's experience, but the mechanisms and how the mechanisms interplay with each other. So when we like to think of this, we like to think of connective tissue variants as like a loop that you, like a lazy river that you get put in. And it doesn't really matter at which point you enter because you're then in the loop. And it's a chicken and egg scenario. Well, what happened first? Was it the hypermobility of the joints, or was it a hypermobility of tissues, or was it tissues becoming more permeable from viral infection, or was it tissues becoming more permeable from bacterial infection, or a physical event like pregnancy, like puberty? It could be hormonal changes. There's all these different entry points in getting on a floaty on the river. But regardless of what your entry point is, you're going to be experiencing this loop of all of these things interplaying. And it may show up as hypermobility of some joints, and it may show up as less mobility of other joints. And it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, when we try and create a linear model for this patient population, we keep pushing people out of that model, and then those people don't get care. That is the main thing we are trying to shift, is instead of pushing people out, what if everybody comes in? And it doesn't really matter what your primary diagnosis is, and it doesn't really matter what your biomarkers are. We'll collect that data, sure, but that's not the defining factor of your experience and how we're going to address it, because ultimately, from our experience at the end of the day, it's different for every single person what works and what doesn't. And there are some ways we can predict that, but ultimately, assuming that everyone's going to fall into these linear ideas of categorization of these concepts that people have just decided on sitting in a room talking without even expanding the diagnostic pool to include a lot of the populations who are more impacted, we're making stuff up. And then what we're doing is we're just creating more barriers over and over again. We're repeating the same problems that patients are facing right now. And we might include a few more people who were pushed out initially and they're happy, but then there are other people who are still dying. And that's where we're really coming from, is why we include all of these diagnoses together, because we're trying to improve care access. And at the end of the day, the same care works for all of these populations. And so why does the diagnosis actually matter? Well, for insurance coverage and medical coding, for sure. Aside from that, we got to do a lot more data-based work to understand how these subpopulations might exist and what the nuances between different demographics and people with different financial situations.
Yeah, and that's the way it should be. And that's why we're building what we're building. And because at the same time, in the research fields, this focus on the joints, this focus on hypermobility as connective tissue disorder, rather than the whole body as connective tissue and all the things that can happen with it, those research fields are focused on the cause of what they consider either connective tissue disorders or what they're kind of now considering infection or other life event triggered systemic changes that ends up cutting people out of care. They focus on what they can find in tests and what they can find in already diagnosed populations. But the reality here is this is a wildly common set of interconnected experiences. We are never going to find one biomarker, one genetic trait, or one other type of molecular trait, or even a combination of traits that apply to this entire population, especially when that research is only on certain populations. For example, lots of the recent huge biomarker research and research trying to kind of reclassify hypermobile EDS and hypermobility spectrum disorders is over 90% white. So how is it going to actually apply to the whole community?
And I will also bring the example of cancer and genetics. I think any area of disease process that a lot of money has been poured into, cancer is the main example of that. Even for specific types of cancer, like breast cancer, there is not one marker. And even if you have that marker, it does not always mean that X, Y, and Z will happen. And we're actually looking at a lot of different factors for risk screening that we don't believe the symptoms to do the imaging to understand if it's there or not. And actually choosing to only focus on those risk factors or those biomarkers to get access to screening, like imaging, increases death in these populations. And we know that. And so it's a full pronged approach where we make sure that we're taking patients seriously to get them in for screening when they notice changes in their body. And maybe a part of that screening is also biomarker screening, but that is not the end all be all, and it should never be. And what's happening with these complex chronic conditions right now is there's such a focus on finding that one reason that all of this is messed up, even though connective tissue is the most ubiquitous type of tissue in the body. We're just pushing people out. We're not getting reproducible results. We're pouring money into studies that are not improving access to care. And ultimately, it takes $1.7 billion on average to make a new medication for a single diagnosis. And if we're only targeting a genetic factor that shows up in less than 1% of the entire population, to me, that's a pretty big waste of money.
How does Hyp+Access define connective tissue? And how does your definition of it diverge from the healthcare industry's common conception of it?
Well, healthcare currently ignores that most tissues are connective tissue, even though technically this is maybe taught at some point in medical school, or at least in pre-med. Healthcare's primary focus is on collagen disorders, which is really interesting to us because collagen is a protein. It's not actually a tissue type. It is not largely what connective tissue is only made of. It is a structural component of connective tissue, as are many other proteins, and even cell types are structural components of connective tissue, like fat and like fibroblasts. Those are also structural. Focusing on collagen disorders perpetuates misinformation around what connective tissue is and how it functions, and how, when variance occurs, what happens. Another really important thing is that in cadaver labs in medical school, you take the connective tissue off of the organ systems and you throw it in the bucket. You throw it away. You don't actually learn how to work with different tissue types, what they look like, what they feel like, how they're surrounding every single other cell type and organizing every single organ structure and every single set of structures that are interconnected. No space is really left in the body. It's filled with different types of connective tissue. And so you have to intentionally spend hours and hours, picking connective tissue off to get to what they consider the true organ systems, when in reality, this tissue is what makes up the organ systems. And when we remove that tissue from the organ systems, or it becomes a problem, the tissue becoming more variant or permeable or whatever, those organ systems do not facilitate well anymore. And that's really how these conditions arise. A lot of medicine focuses on the aesthetics or the physical look of somebody rather than the way people are impacted by environmental triggers, or mysterious illnesses of an unknown cause. A lot of times, people do not put together that mold exposure increases connective tissue variance and therefore causes people to develop a lot of these conditions simultaneously. Medical providers and researchers in the medical research part of this field are not thinking about the mechanisms of these tissues interplaying. So that basic connective tissue cell knowledge is not integrated into how they think about the disease processes. Unlike more traditional corners of the medical field, we know that connective tissue is not just collagen and it's also not just joints. Like the casing on your brain is solely connective tissue. The casing on many organ systems is solely connective tissue. It includes blood, bone, fat, fascia, lymph, and so much more. We also argue that epithelial tissue is a specialized form of connective tissue. It just happens to be have a certain kind of barrier function between different tissue layers. Most connective tissues that connect and organize systems include many kinds of connective tissue cell types, like our backgrounds here. Connective tissue surrounds every other cell type in the body by surrounding a single cell, putting single cells together into sometimes what are called vesicles, grouping those vesicles together into subcomponents of organ systems, and it really just goes on. What I love to talk the most about, though, is that connective tissue exclusively houses the sense receptors, and not just the sense receptors that allow you to feel things, but those exact same sense receptors that allow you to feel things are the exact same sense receptors that are actually regulating all of your body systems. This is another reason that we really value patient experience and the physical experience of what it's like to be in their body, because they are sensing those receptors, and those receptors are actually regulating those systems. And those receptors are only in connective tissue. So when a muscle, for example, contracts or activates or squeezes, and you feel that muscle squeezing, you're feeling the receptors being squished that are in the connective tissue between the muscle cells. You're not actually feeling the receptors in the muscle cells. So this means that connective tissue connects body systems and it facilitates all of their communication and regulation processes. So connective tissue actually makes up the main building blocks of the body. It's not just connecting things together. So even the word connective tissue is a little bit of a misnomer, to be completely honest. And this is why connective tissue variance impacts every organ system and causes these multi-symptom issues, and can also be impacted by so many different environmental triggers. So we recognize not only that joints and tissue layers and certain kinds of cells are their own types of connective tissue, we differentiate them from each other to better understand the impacts of connective tissue variance, but we're not isolating them into different disease processes because they don't work in isolation at all.
And to add a little bit more about collagen and the joints, collagen as a protein is a really important building block in the connective tissues that keep joints together and provide stability to joints. But again, it's not the only thing in the body, and joints are not the only thing impacted by connective tissue in the body. So when we over focus on the joints, on what people can aesthetically see, and on collagen as just one of many building blocks, one of many structural components within connective tissue, then we lose the systemic nature of these conditions.
And we lose the nuance and diversity of the ways that people develop these issues over their life. Once you look at all of these diagnostic requirements for every single diagnosis, you start to notice that all of the symptom sets are the same and they actually mirror each other. And so when somebody falls into one diagnosis, that doesn't mean that they don't have another. It's just their symptoms were valuable to that diagnostic classification, which they really are to every single diagnostic classification. We know that connective tissues connect the issues regardless of if somebody falls into the somewhat arbitrary connective tissue diagnostic criteria. And so we know that regardless of what diagnoses people are able to receive, we are treating essentially the same set of issues that just develops differently in different people through different environmental triggers or just by being born, right? And it's less about continuing to isolate these populations into subpopulations and more about bringing them together, housing them under one roof to really understand where are the differences? How do these things show up together? How do they interplay? And what is the best way to approach treatment? To donate to Hyp+Access, visit hypaccess.org/donate. Thank you so much.